Thanks for giving up an afternoon for a discussion around what we think is an interesting set of outputs from a 3-year or 3 and a bit year study now on understanding mobility. So it comes out of a request from the research councils to look at how we can tackle the problem of habitual travel behaviour and just how difficult it is to change what people do. The project that this came from turned that on its head and said, well, how stable is everything? And can we understand things by looking at change rather than just focusing on stability? So we're going to present snippets of our findings, but this is very much a policy-oriented workshop. So we're going to present you with our policy proposition that's come out of our research. So the notion which we've brought you here under is something which we call Flexi-mobility. And what we mean by that is essentially what is it that needs to be done inside transport and outside transport to make travelling by different options more normal, more feasible and more embedded over time. So just that we would see greater diversity in how we travel around the system over time. So what is it that would have to be done to make that possible? So why think about that in particular as a goal of policy? Well, different organisations, parties of different political persuasions disagree about the relative importance of different aspects of transport policy, so the extent to which air quality is or is not important over time, how important congestion is to the economy, whether we should angst about our contribution to climate change and the implications on our networks, the extent to which it's the role of government or not to look at the public health implications of diet and exercise, and so on. We think that a common solution, whichever side of the political spectrum you come from, whichever of those policies you think are more or less important, really travelling a little less by car and a little bit more by other means of transport ticks all of those boxes in some way, shape or form. So other solutions matter, other solutions are critical. We're not saying that we could achieve our carbon targets by using cars a little bit less. We need some big technological innovation to do that. But in order to achieve all of the different things that we're trying to do, this has to be a part of our thinking about transport policy for the future, and obviously to some extent it is now, but we would say not in a very systematic way. One of the other things that we think is really important to acknowledge in saying that we need to think about how we can facilitate more diversity in how we travel is whether or not we do anything as transport planners and providers. There is an awful lot of change happening anyway. In fact, there is more change happening from outside of transport policy that impacts mobility patterns than there is within transport policy. So changes to our pensions in the long run, changes to working hours and contracts, the recession, changes to education, the importance of student loans or what kind of travel benefits we do or don't give to people, making them stay in education from 16 to 18. All of these things have a significant impact on how we travel. Changing ethnic diversity of our populations. We know that different cultures have different travel patterns. Smartphones, tablets and so on are changing not just how we access travel information, but all sorts of things that we do, what it means to be connected, things like ageing. So all of this dwarfs most of our transport interventions. The change in fuel prices in the last 3 months, which have nothing to do with transport policy, is a bigger shift than you would ever consider feasible. As a government, you would never increase or reduce prices by a third, in such a short space of time. So our question is, do we think about a transport policy which engages with all of this change and says actually our transport policy ought to be thinking about change rather than stability, and it ought to be asking in what ways can we facilitate this change in ways which over time continue to make it more easy to travel a little bit less by car. We also think we need to be very careful to avoid the stale car versus non-car debate. It's not either A or B. Everyone is multimodal. And that's true if you look across people's life, We don't all start life as car drivers. We start as people who move around in a whole range of different ways. We might get ferried around in a car, but we will use all sorts of different forms of transport. So it's true if you look across the life course, but it's also true if you look at what people do across the year. Whether it's the occasional taxi home from a works do, or whether it's the once a year visit on a train to family at a distance, we all use different forms of transport at different points for different purposes. So can we capitalise on that? Can we make that more attractive? So it's not either or, it's what and when, which would be the way to think about it. So here's some kind of insights from our work about why change is not so difficult when you look at how much change is going on. It shows us how we might be able to start to think about interventions. So we're going to present 5 evidence-based contentions from our data. And the importance of this is to say, one of the reasons that we focused a lot on habit, it's partly because there is a kind of pattern to how people travel, but we've overemphasised that by predominantly having cross-sectional data for transport planning. Most of our surveys are single snapshot points in time. We have very little panel data, and we presume when we ask people about the way they normally get to work that that's how they always get to work. But in actual fact, that's how they normally get to work, and around that there's a lot of variation. So we would say that we've been looking to some degree under the wrong stone by focusing on stability and cross-sectional. And if you look at aggregate travel patterns, you might say, well, Leeds is more or less as congested now as it was a month ago. Well, that might be true, but there has been work done. In fact, Peter Bonsall here 20 years ago showed that if you look at any one particular section of road from one day to the next in a quarter of an hour period, only half the cars there on one day are there the following day. So there is a lot of variability in what and when. So, some stats from our project. We collected data in a range of different circumstances. We did some longitudinal work with households. We did some studies of particular disruptive events. So we looked at flooding, we looked at what happens when it snows, we looked at an office reconsolidation in York, which I'll talk a little bit more about. We looked at the Olympics, and we did a large-scale national survey. So I'm going to pull bits of data from all sorts of different spaces, which we have gone through and think tells us something about the following contentions. I mean, those data come from very different sources, but we think there's a logic to the way we've assembled this. So, looking at variability, 76% of Londoners surveyed do not always travel to work in the same way every day. So that's by the same mode, not even thinking about the time at which they travel. York City Council did a consolidation from 12 different sites in the city centre to one, and they tried to introduce more flexible working at the same time, so more of a hot desking type arrangement. Almost one half of the employees didn't know exactly how many days they would be in their office the next week. So, already you can see that clearly it's not fixed exactly how they're going to negotiate their travel plans for that week. A quarter of disruptions to journeys, so why people have to change how they travel, are not caused by what happens on the transport network. They're caused by family members asking them to do things, or colleagues requiring them to be in particular meetings or so on. So they end up changing their journey patterns as a result of things which are not to do with the transport network. We do know that more than half of people change their main mode to work every decade. We know that moving house and changing job, and the combination of moving house and changing job, has a very important impact on how people decide to get to work. And we know that people move reasonably regularly. And we know that the employment market is not as stable as it used to be. So there is an awful lot of change going on. So can we build on that change, or is that problematic in some way? Doing some things differently some of the time is acceptable. So as a proposition that we ought to be encouraging people to do things a bit differently more, can we start by pointing to the fact that people do things a bit differently? And the answer is yes. So many people already adapt. So in the 6-city survey that we did, 28% of people said it would have been very easy to travel at a different time of the day, 23% to use a different mode, and 17% to have postponed their trip, so moving things in time, bigger chunks of time rather than just half an hour here or there. 54% of people changed their journeys to work in the Olympics, and that happened in various different ways. But when you also dig down into the London data, people change how they travel for a whole range of reasons that you kind of think, oh really, that's quite interesting, like temperature, stress, boredom, all sorts of factors that suggest people aren't totally fixed on one particular way of doing things. And as we said before, if you look across the life course, there's an awful lot of variability in how people have done things. So what would we have to do to create the conditions where a bit more variability becomes acceptable? Now obviously the capacity for flexibility varies across social groups, family structures and life stages. There isn't a homogeneous single individual that you can point to and say, well, that's the amount of variability people have. So in our data we've seen some very interesting findings around, for example, the extent to which caring responsibilities for adults or children has a very important structuring nature on what trips you can and can't flex and how much flexibility you have. Your role in an organisation and the way the organisation works. So I've just been doing some analysis of the York City Council office consolidation. Before their move, the average number of days worked at home a week was 0.3 for the council as a whole. We asked them how many days a week they would like to work from home, and it was 1.5 days. This is after the move. And how many days they could work at home and still do their job effectively, and that was 2.2 days. So they don't really want to push it so far because they enjoy or feel that there's a need to be in work. But actually the number of days that they do work from home is 0.6. So it's doubled from what it was before, and it's doubled from what it was before because the organisation's changed how it works, but it isn't what people would necessarily like to do, partly because of the need for coordination with meetings, things like the need to come into work to print or store things, and all the other kinds of stuff that go on around home and work relationships. So it begins to reveal some of the factors that make just looking at an individual's choice and preferences too narrow a way of thinking about it. We have to think a little bit more about the system. Other things on there that we've come across, disability and the assumptions that are made about how easy it is to move around the system are quite variable, and we think that a lot of our planning software and so on is based around what the average healthy white male might be able to achieve rather than necessarily being tailored to the full users of the system. So thinking about individual choice is too narrow, which isn't to say that a lot of the stuff that we've been doing around smarter choices is not the right sort of thing to do, but in and of itself it's not enough because there are other things that would need to change to make it more effective. Skills and resources we've seen to be extremely important. So let's start with some of the data. The 6-city survey, the most multimodal people are the best at coping with transport system disruptions, and if you're already a habitual kind of multimodal user during the Olympics, you are far more likely to adapt. Similarly, if you're regularly exposed to snow and ice problems, you're more likely to have alternative options for working at home or using an alternative means of transport. People develop skills that enable them to do things differently. Those skills are things which we need to build up over time, so cultivate and nurture them, right the way through from some of the good work that goes on in school travel planning through to what happens as people make the transition to work or university or wherever, and further on into life. So these skills and resources, you can't just expect people to turn the tap on and do things differently. We have to build this up as part of our transport policy over time. So we've begun to touch on this, that there are some important contextual differences, which is one of the reasons we're having these workshops, is to say, well, it's all right saying it looks like that in London, what does it feel like in Leeds, what does it look like in York, etc. So cultures of mobility are important, as well as the core access, the core networks around which any variability might be thought about. So what does it all mean? Our kind of suite of implications from that. So just summing up, variability in how we travel is a feature of daily life, and I suppose that could be how we travel when we travel and indeed where we travel. Society is changing in ways which make this variability an increasing feature or possibility. So we think that there are various underlying social trends which mean that, for example, time in employment is, we no longer see people in the same organisations, in the same roles for the same amount of time. We also think there are new opportunities emerging through technology, so the interchange of information and opportunities are opening up change, variability, flexibility, the ability to negotiate arrangements at short notice and so on over time. We do find that most people are able to adapt when faced with a need to change, at least in the short run, and actually we've got some evidence of the longer run beginning to come through from things like the City of York Council. It's not all just possible in the short run, but some of it is easier to do in the short run. But it's a kind of Darwinian truth. If we're faced with a set of constraints, we will find a way of managing our way around those. The point is, it's not actually as painful necessarily as people might imagine. So adaptability is evident in how people are doing things now. So do we support them to become more adaptable or not as a focus of policy? So it's all well and good saying that, but what would we have to do to make it easier for that adaptability to become more a kind of managed part of our policy process? So what would we have to do at a systemic level to push people and pull them into this more adaptable, less car-dependent way of doing things? So we think there are some deliberate interventions which could be undertaken to begin to make this seem to be a more normal way of getting around. Time seems to be particularly important, and some people have more or less control over their time, some people have more or less resources with which they can make different choices about how to use their time, cost of different forms of travel and so on. But time is something that I don't think we've given quite enough thought to in transport policy, so we need to also factor that into our thinking about change. Back to our Flexi-mobility proposition then. What is it that we would need to do to support a more diverse set of travel practices? What is it that we would need to see happen on the street, in Leeds or wherever, in order for it to be more normal for people to do things by more different options, more of the time? So we're going to try and provide you with some examples. Okay, so by more normal, more often, more of the time, for example, we would see less of that kind of stuff and more of this kind of thinking. Now, we've thought through a range of different aspects of what we're calling the mobility system, which is not just the transport system, which need to be thought through in order to really have a comprehensive approach to this. So if we were to be thinking, for example, about the transport system in the case of the City of York Council, when they moved their offices, we would have been interested in what they did with their parking policy, what they did with bikes and showers, and how the location of their site related to the network. But as you can see from the evidence we gave you on working from home, you've got to think about a whole range of other factors if you're really going to capitalise on the opportunity that presents. So we're going to talk about some of these domains now, some of which I think are things which you already do and you already know that you should be doing, and that's for us a bonus. We're not saying rip everything up and start again, we're saying build on what you're already doing. So some time flexibility. To mention time as being really important. What is it that we can do to ease some of the rigidities in the system that make travelling by car more likely, more often? So what is it about, for example, the availability of childcare around schools and the extent to which there is or isn't wraparound care in different circumstances? What is it about flexible working rights or opportunities in the city? Have we really looked at the kind of range of opportunities and what that means for travel patterns? To what extent is evening public transport a part of our thinking or not, and for what purposes? So there are some parts of the country where that's obviously more prevalent than others. Increasing affordable, flexible car access schemes. So rather than people always having either a binary choice between their own car or public transport, that they can sometimes make that choice of using a car when the time pressures are such that they need to make that choice. So, evening transport, better school bus provision, all those sorts of things might make this easier for people to make choices around non-car-based travel. Presenteeism in work and the culture of presenteeism, not just the policy that's written down on paper, makes a difference. The quality of broadband, whether actually working from home is feasible, attractive, and it's not obviously possible for everyone. Social norms. By this we mean that by being more multimodal more often, things aren't more difficult for you, because that's just a message that actually this system isn't designed for you to occasionally drop in and use. So we think things like contactless payment across all transport modes, so not necessarily smart cards, but just tapping your credit card. Cost-effective single journey tickets, which I think is a challenge, and it's something that needs to be thought through in terms of business models of transport operators and how we regulate the transport system. Free Wi-Fi is becoming much more prevalent. Mobility proficiency training for all children, which I think Leeds has actually got a very good programme here, but really starting and building that in more firmly into our early years. Some other policies that we'll get you to talk about, maybe making employers accountable for employee transport through some kind of business rate policy. This is a little bit complicated, but the example is based on GlaxoSmithKline, where they say, yeah, you can have a parking permit to work here, but it's only valid for 3 weeks in 4. So the social norm is not that you can't drive to work, but there's only a certain number of days that you've got access to the car park. So it's not normal for you to drive to work all of the time. Simple thing to do, difficult to argue that it's damaging to the economy if one of our flagship employers is already doing it. So much more of the occasional parking permit rather than the kind of you're a paid-in participant, and you might as well use it because, well, you've paid for the whole year anyway. So a lot more flexibility in that dimension. Again, what would make the system more normal? Not if you've got a bike, please ring up and tell us that you want to come on this train, but actually, which kinds of services might we want to be providing? Is it the case that we ought to be thinking about different forms of train carriage configuration that you see in other parts of the continent? It's not just for the operators that would have to adapt to that. I think there'll be a whole range of other things that would need to happen. Spatial interventions. Well, again, I think this is probably stuff which we've known for a long time, but that we continue to find difficult to achieve. The sorts of planning decisions that support more variable or greater opportunity for diversity in how we travel clearly mean putting things in places where there are services or prospect of services which will enable that. And where there aren't, it's maybe thinking through more demand-responsive type solutions. And I think, again, given the cuts in public spending, we're going to have to think again about what flexible public transport might look like. So some examples. This is Copenhagen. Although I've got bike parking on here, this is an edge of town shopping centre. It's located right near one of the commuter railway stops. That's just a visible bit of social norming on cycling. So it's a short walk to the shopping centre, even though it's edge of town and would have reasonable car accessibility. Right by the front door there is cycle parking, not car parking. So again, it's a reinforcing message. Put things in places which are accessible and make them convenient by a range of modes. It's not Eric Pickle's town centres are in decline, let's have free parking and things will regenerate. Right, so in terms of then some more systemic things to shift the debate. First example we thought through is seasonality. Actually, when you think about it, it's remarkable how consistent our transport policies are year round, given that we know people do things differently in the summer to in the winter. What of our transport policies do we change to encourage people to do more of what they already might want to do in the summer and accept maybe that they'll do a bit less of it in the winter. So seasonal reallocation of road space and non-motorised transport could be feasible. Differentiated fuel duty if the national government was interested in taking that sort of thing on. So not all of these solutions sit at a local level. Things like street blitzes where, this comes from the idea of like cleaning up a whole street or route. But could you do that with transport? So could you focus on intensively improving the transport in particular parts of the city for a period of time and then take some of that away and leave some of it there? A bit like the kickstart schemes that we had in policy 10 years ago, but maybe perhaps more intensively focused. Give people an opportunity to experience something with a different level of quality and see what happens. Moments of change, there's quite a lot written about this now, that this is effective. If we can intervene with people during their house moves and their job changes, that's a time to get people to proactively engage with more of these options. So we've had some debates and scepticism about doing things differently, seasonal reallocation of road space, just trying things. Right? That's what they did in New York. They just tried some stuff. They didn't spend vast amounts of money. This is their interim plaza program. So they basically just do a fairly low-cost treatment of the area. It does help that it's winter there and kind of summer here, so it just looks nicer. But it's a relatively low-cost treatment, which just makes the area feel quite different. And they haven't just done one of these, they've done a whole series of these. So could we imagine more adaptability in our infrastructure, some of which might be facilitated by physical stuff, and some of which might be more intelligent transport? This is a picture of Huddersfield, but the quote's from Hebden Bridge, and this is the Tour de France. So kids could play or use their bikes on the streets without fear of being run over. It was a day of relief from the usual weekend siege. We enjoyed our freedom. I admit I was wrong. My misgivings were misplaced. We should try some stuff. It doesn't have to be every day of the week. It can be, there's lots of cities around the world that have car-free areas every weekend. We could do more. We could try more stuff. It would just help to build the norm around what we do. So an aspiration would be that it would be a not so special event, that a road was closed at a particular time of day. It's something that we might expect to see, that our network is being used in a more variable way. Our thinking behind this is that we're in a bit of kind of problem in our policy discussions. Business as usual is down here. The pressure from things like carbon targets suggests we need to make a massive change, but really what's the politics of making a massive change? Actually, change always happens incrementally. There are billions of journeys that happen in the UK. If you look at all the cities around Europe that do it well, it hasn't happened overnight. It's happened because they've had a consistent set of policies and a vision about what they want to achieve, and they've gradually built that up over time. And if we can do that, then maybe some of the more interventionist policies, if we need to go there around really proactively managing demand, become a bit easier, because actually we all realise that it's not so painful to do things a bit differently some of the time.